Hello, Obscure Titan has returned with a writing essay. Today I wish to have a video on a console that I've been playing for 5 years and still do to this day, the Sega Saturn. The Saturn has been known to being one of the most ill-fated hardware in the 1990s, but it's also one of the biggest commercial failures in gaming history, whether it's a complex hardware, lack of third-party support, and one of the worst launches. While it did well in Japan, the US release was botched. It got so bad that it was being cancelled in 1998 in favor of the Dreamcast, which would soon be cancelled in 2001. Over the years, however, the Sega Saturn would garner a cult following. Despite its botched launch and complex hardware, anyone who bought into the console were fascinated with its redeeming qualities, which definitely has some. In this essay video, I want to go over its origins and console specs, then go over games I played, and want to make recommendations if anyone is interested in buying the Sega Saturn. Sources will be provided in the description to properly give context to what information I give regarding to the first two sections, while I'll give my own take on the games. It all started back in 1991 with rumors of a successor to the Sega Genesis. Obviously, the Super Nintendo has been the competitor to the Genesis in the 90s, even considered the superior hardware. Sega was pushing for an earlier leap into 32-bit. The gaming industry was still fresh in the 16-bit era, and started exploring into the CD-based media, Sega CD being an add-on to the Genesis. While things were changing, the Atari Jaguar, CDI, and 3DO were challenging Sega in the West and Japan. Throughout the early to mid-90s, a group of 27 members started developing the Saturn project. It would come with its own specialties, which would be handled by Hideko Sato, who was responsible for the design of Sega's prior main console lineup. It took the team roughly 2 years on the Saturn exclusively. As 1993 went on, the Saturn was being said to either be 32-bit or 64, the former being the probable choice, though no backwards compatibility for the Genesis. However, the cartridge part would end up being the memory card. It went through several concepts before being finalized, the Sega Jupiter and Mars. The latter even considered the 32-bit equivalent to the Genesis, which ended up being its add-on, the 32X. The Sega Saturn was released on November 22, 1994 in Japan, less than 2 weeks earlier than the Sony PlayStation. Initially, it was selling well. Titles such as Virtua Fighter, One-Shot Connection, and a few others were to follow. Having roughly 500,000 consoles ready to be sold on launch day, it seemed like it was going well, though Sega held back on 300,000 in storage for a week, in an attempt to catch a fledgling PlayStation off guard. Sega was still ahead of Sony in terms of consoles in Japan. While Sony was ahead of the figures at that point, their games had to be purchased separately, adding to the cost. The Japanese lineup for the Saturn was going pretty strong compared to its predecessors. The North American release, however, was a different story. Both Sega of America and Japan worked differently in terms of leadership. One wanted one way or the other, with Japan's CEO being the decision factor, which Tom Kalinske ends up caving to despite his warnings. Initially, Sega of America announced Saturn Day for the Sega Saturn's release on September 2nd, 1995, hoping to have games prepared for it with at least 10. It was meant to have 20 titles with an addition of 100 by Christmas. Much like the Genesis, there were plans for test markets. But this is where things got messy for Sega. Knowing PlayStation would be catching up in sales, Sega tried to get a surprise launch ready. Despite Tom Kalinske's warnings, the CEO of Japan just did not listen, which led to the infamous E3 1995 conference press, and to be released immediately instead of its planned release date. This not only was a surprise to the show's audience, but also to developers and retailers. Sony took this as an opportunity to destroy Sega with one of its representatives to have a long speech, and we all know how that went. $299. This cemented the PlayStation's uprising. The PS1 was only $300. The Saturn was $100 more, adding up to $400 in total. This was one of the worst launches in game console history. Not only did the Sega Saturn perform poorly internationally, but it alienated its audience. The fact that games like Panzer Dragoon Saga, Burning Rangers, and a few others became much harder to obtain. The Sega Saturn has only sold roughly 9 million units, whereas the Sony PlayStation throughout its lifetime has sold more than 100 million units. Ouch. The Sega Saturn, despite its complications with developers, was an immersive piece of hardware, having a total of 8 processors, said to be 3 in the commercials. But those 3 main are the 2 Hitachi SH2 processors running at 28 MHz, and the Saturn control unit. The other attributes such as the CD-ROM CPU, Hitachi SH132 processor, at 20 MHz and the microcontroller Hitachi HC404920. Unlike the PS1, where it has 2 memory card slots, and each going up to 8 KB or 1 MB. The Saturn has only one, but it can go up to 512 KB, although there are action replay cartridges which can go up to 4 MB. It can play region-locked games, making it a go-to for playing Japanese ports on American consoles, or the other way around. The 2D side of the console is what many who bought the Saturn find it admirable. Games such as Dragon Force and any fighting game are where its capabilities are best utilized. One of the best performances in 2D gaming. It's an improvement over the 32X in terms of sound quality and even visually to some extent. The game controller would usually range from its US launch design with the clicky bumpers and the signature Japanese one, where its buttons are more in line with the Genesis and smoother in design. There's also a 3D spaceship gamepad, arguably one of the first to utilize its digital analog stick. Not much of a stick, but more of a thumb pad. The spaceship gamepad has a switch which can be used to go from digital to a D-pad, and will only work on a select few games such as Knights and Panzer Dragoon 2. And to be quite frank, I find the Saturn 3D pad to be more enjoyable to play with than the Dreamcasts. It'll actually stick to your thumb, I know because I own 2 of them. Yep, I'm the proud owner of 2 Saturn 3D gamepads. That being said, the 3D side of the console is where things get complicated. Before we get to the exclusives, let's take a look at a select few third-party games. One of them that I actually own. To start off, Tomb Raider is one of the most prominent examples of why the Sega Saturn was considered inferior to the Sony PlayStation. I bought a Japanese copy of the game to see how Tomb Raider holds up. For how it is, it's alright. The cutscenes on both copies look identical enough and the sound quality to some extent. However, the loading screens tend to be a bit different at times. Playing through the game though is where differences become apparent. The Saturn copy looks a bit more saturated but darker. The visuals, water being one of them, aren't as polished as the PlayStation's. Alive is another example. The Saturn copy's visuals aren't as prominent or polished as the PlayStation's, almost as if the Saturn copy wasn't using the same visuals as the PlayStation for the developers to make it work. Doom also suffers on the Saturn. From what I can gather is its frame rates tend to drop during gameplay. The sound is coming a lot louder, but not enough to save this version. What made the PlayStation work for third-party developers was its simpler hardware. It was easier to develop games for the PlayStation than with both the Sega Saturn and the Nintendo 64. The Sega Saturn, as previously stated, has a total of 8 processors. Theoretically, this should make the Saturn the better console, but with the complex hardware, on top of Sega's lack of connection with the developers at the time and rushed launch, games such as Tomb Raider and Doom perform weaker than the PS1. The PS1 only has 1 processor. In fact, it actually had 2 co-processors and CPU named COP0 and COP2, according to retroversing.com. As you can imagine, the Nintendo 64 is slightly less complex and made it more difficult for the Saturn to push beyond 1997. That being said, let's give the Saturn some appreciation and look at its exclusives. When you think of the Sega Saturn, you think of Knights, Shining Force 3, and Panzer Dragoon. The latter is what we'll start with. Panzer Dragoon is a railgun shooter series developed by Team Andromeda, which has you control a dragon as you take your battles to the skies. This was the Sega equivalent to the Star Fox series by Nintendo. What makes this game distinguishable is it's more complex in game design than other railgun shooters. You go through each level to shoot enemies and keep your dragon alive. However, you can switch the camera and fend off against anything coming your way behind and on the sides. You can use 2 methods of attack. One is shooting with a laser gun from the rider by pressing the A button. Another is holding the same button to target enemies, the dragon's energy breath. The premise for the first game is a group of riders entering a cavern, which leads to the attack inside, and we're scattered. A dragon approaches with a previous rider who got killed shortly after. The main character, Kiel Fludge, takes the dragon to fend off enemies that the previous rider was against. It turns out there's been a war between humans and their biologically engineered weapons. Now, its sequel, Panzer Dragoon 2, is actually a prequel. The premise for that game is that there was a little baby dragon, Kula in the lore, who was saved by Jean-Luc Lundy. It turns out that the Kulas, save for the one Lundy saved, were killed as unlucky ones. Lundy left the village and went about his way. Lundy takes his dragon to battle an empire seeking to kill him and his dragon. The gameplay elements are similar to what the first game offered. What makes it feel different this time was the following. The dragon can be upgraded through the levels. The better the performance, the more powerful. Another is a Berserk mode, which has your dragon send out a blaze of glory at any enemy unfortunate enough to perish. There's also a selection of pathways which can make the experience somewhat more riveting than its predecessor, or successor, chronologically speaking. Both of these rail shooters were excellent and fun competitors to Star Fox 64, and I would highly recommend them. You can easily buy the Japanese copies since they already have the English text, save for the cutscenes. They don't need a whole lot of reading. There's a 2020 remake for the first game on the Nintendo Switch and so on, but the second one is yet to be confirmed. Sega tends to drop the ball when it comes to RPGs in the West. I say this because despite Genesis having much potential and exposure and appreciation, their executives tend to hold back while Sony is enjoying their success with Final Fantasy VII. Dragon Force is one of the RPGs I started playing and adored since then. The premise follows the land of Legendra, a place of prosperity under its deity named Astia. However, a malicious entity named Madrak invades Legendra and sets it ablaze. He was confronted by the Dragon Force, also known as the Star Dragon of Haskat, and waged war. However, personal issues led to their downfall and unable to kill the Dark God. 300 years later, Madrak remained sealed but not killed. However, the seal keeping him was weakened by his two disciples, Scythe and Gaul. They manipulate the 8 nations of Legendra and further exploit their weaknesses. As for gameplay, you can choose one of the 8 kingdoms to play as: Emperor Drunan of Tristan, Emperor Mikal of Izumo, Goldark of Pandaria, King Leon of Topaz, Lord Gongos of Bozak, Queen Tetris of Pale Moon, Reinhard of Tanjore, and Wayne of Highland. Each monarch comes with their own set of soldiers to send in battle, but there's more characters you can have that start out depending on which kingdom you pick and progress with more as you either defeat them or they join in friendly terms without a fight, the former being the most likely case scenario. In each time you play, you'll be met with a map of kingdoms you can direct your soldiers or monarch to embark on the other kingdoms or unaligned fortresses. You're given a limited time to enact on said locations. If you enter a kingdom, you're met with a group of characters either challenged to a fight or talk things out. Again, the former being more probable. Once you accept the fight, you have options to go about the battle. You can call your troops to disperse, standby, retreat, regroup, melee, or advance. But once you have chosen melee, you can't undo the action. This was eventually fixed in the sequel, but let's keep our focus on the first game. There's other settings in combat to put into play, such as defense, special, offense, and raid. However you wish to see fit for your strategy, you can use to overcome your enemies. Your monarch or character has their own moves too. The power, or MP, gauge can be filled up as it regenerates. Once it does, you can use it for special moves such as Sonic Boom. No, not that Sonic Boom. This Sonic Boom, a sword-slashing ability to defeat your enemy. Once all soldiers are killed on both sides, the leaders are pitted against each other in a duel. It's primarily based on luck. Whoever comes out on top, and health, the winner is declared. That, or the leader decides to retreat. Either way, the battle is over. Depending on the outcome, the enemy flees or has their allies taken prisoner. Once the time on the map is over, you're called into a meeting in your kingdom for report. In this segment, you can check out on your generals, promote them, or negotiate with prisoners into submission. If said prisoner becomes an ally, it'll add to your militia. This can be helpful if you are seeking to expand, but once you make more progress, you'll eventually enter one of the kingdoms before you go further. Here's one instance. If you play as Mikal, you'll run into Gonzo before you come across Leon and Tetris. It doesn't have to be this order, however, and that's what makes it an exciting game. You can go about however you wish to play. However, you'll come across unexpected encounters during gameplay. You'll also run into Madrak's forces throughout the game, Scythe and Gaul. In each kingdom you play as, while the main plot remains the same, you'll get to see their perspective on the conflict. For one, Junon in most stories start out as a scary and vicious master in black armor, but in her own story, it starts off with her showing her face early on. Something eventually happens in other stories later on. Even Goldark is seen as a bad guy throughout both stories until later on. It's worth pointing out that Madrak's minions were working alongside with Goldark to manipulate his kingdom. I can see why Dragon Force is seen so favorably by those who played it. It's a role-playing masterpiece. The style of gameplay really gets me excited for whatever is ahead. There's a good amount of replay value to be found here, and having 8 kingdoms to play as adds up to 8 times the hours that I've spent playing. Imagine if you were to spend 10 hours or more on each kingdom. That would add up to 80 in total. The variety of characters really do add to the use of them. Cavalries, harpies, monks, and samurai. The list goes on. I definitely say check it out. It's a worthy entry to get. It's a little pricey, but not as much as a few others that we'll see in this video. Roughly between $200 to $300. This is one of the most unnoticed games to come out internationally. It was only available in Japan at the time. This was actually released in the arcade in May 1998, developed by Treasure. It received a Saturn release sometime after in the same year. However, its Japanese exclusivity wouldn't null its well-earned critical acclaim from Western audiences who bought copies of them. The premise of the game is a group of cruisers receive a message from Chief Igarashi and find out that it was the last day to test the Silvergun starfighter prototypes. The crew venture each levels to lead up to the finale of the game. This game has parts of each level. Set in a top-down shooter, you face against an arsenal of enemies coming at you, directly or otherwise. Each ship comes with a Vulcan, running at rapid firepower, homing, energy blast to home, and spread, warheads from the sides at a 22.5 degree angle. There's also others you can combine with backspread, a single shot at front and multiple at back, homing plasma, 2 tracking lines moving around and anything caught in them gets shot, and lock on spread, expanding a circle to target enemies. There's a radiant sword. You can activate it by pressing all 3 buttons. This could be useful to destroy anything close range and collect pink energy orbs to build up a gauge. Once filled up, you can make a hyper sword, a much larger sword which can wipe out anything on both sides like a pair of scissors. The more your weapons upgrade, the more powerful they become, level 33 being the maximum. The fortunate thing on the Saturn copy is that your progress can be saved. Once you get it saved, you can come back and proceed with the weapons you upgraded. The enemies vary in colors, those in red, yellow, and blue. Depending how many you destroy in the same color, you get bonus points. This can also be done by destroying the bosses in a methodical manner. They have different segments which can be demolished. Oh, and there's a dog character named Mary, who happens to provide point bonuses, though I don't recall running into it. The learning curve was surprisingly easier than I anticipated when I began playing the game. The use of weaponry and skills make it a thrilling experience. Each level gets harder and it hasn't bored me. In fact, this can be a little too infuriating when not successful. But the fun part is that you can pull off different methods to surpass the levels. It's no wonder why this game was sought after for a long time. However, as much as I adore having it on the Saturn, this can also be played on the Xbox 360 and recently Nintendo Switch. This is where things get a bit strange, and by that I mean its international release. For some reason, only the American and European releases have Scenario 1, while Japan has all 3. The story has you play as a character named Synbios, a Republican dignitary taking his father's place when the Republic Empire peace happened. However, it went downhill. Thus, Synbios and his group go on an adventure to return home, with situations on both sides being twisted by the conflict of the story. It's a turn-based RPG, no surprise there. Each battle has you play in square grids, and each unit takes up 1. Characters can be an ally, controlled by you, the player, or enemies, by AI. They can move to fixed movement lengths. They can also attack, cast a spell, search, or use an item. They can stay and defend if you choose to do nothing. There are no generic units to include, but the enemies do. Goals in the battle tend to vary, but mostly have you kill all enemies. The leader of the enemy group and advance to a town or place the player is reaching. Essentially, you do what Disgaea has you do before the series was even conceived. However, there's a catch in all of this. If Synbios, Julian, or Midian in their respective scenarios are killed, escape the battle, either by egress or retreating to town, the player is sent back to a church or recover allies and such. On the bright side, all the progress you made in said battles is not lost. The level and experience will be kept as is no matter what outcome. Essentially, it'll get easier in each level, which will result in a victory later on. The first scenario is comprised of 5 chapters. Each one has you travel in towns or landmarks. You'll have opportunities to buy items, weapons, heal allies, and save your progress. You can ask NPCs around for information in the story or just general conversations. Your characters to play as have their own skills you can utilize in the battlefield. Some like Synbios are swordsmen who can fight off against opponents with a sword. Some like him can also use magic such as lightning, although characters such as Grace are more geared to magic, hence the lack of attack power. On the other hand, Khan is a monk who can specialize magic in some form, as well as attack. To expand on this, I can see similarities to Disgaea in many ways. For one, they both have square grids to place units in. Each are turn-based, which is an obvious one to begin with. More aspects they both share are upgrading characters, healing, getting items, and saving the game. The only major difference they have up until Disgaea D2 Brighter Darkness is you can keep the progress and level ups in Shining Force 3. Keep in mind, this game came out in 1997 in Japan and 1998 in both America and Europe. Disgaea's first entry was released in 2003. So far, I've only played the first scenario and have 2 and 3 to get to afterwards. It's a fairly sought-after entry of the series, although it's received a reproduction fan translation copy so people who want to play both scenarios 2 and 3 can play them, provided if you either have a modded Saturn or a repro Saturn cartridge to play burn games. The storyline for these 3 scenarios have a connection to the primary plot. You get to have a variety of characters, both gameplay and storyline, and it has a good amount of replay value. Even after finishing a story-based mission, you can journey to a few previous locations to keep leveling up your character. As previously stated, you can still have all your progress in the battle saved and it wouldn't be lost, so it'll be easier to win over time. If you're still not sure about getting the game, you can start out with Scenario 1 on how it is for you, either official American copy or reproduction copy. If you feel it really gets you interested into the game and whatnot, you can get into Scenarios 2 and 3. Give those a chance. They're just as good as the first, though I haven't got to them yet, but I'll get to them eventually. One of the more common games to come out on the Sega Saturn. This was released after its predecessor came out. To give a bit of context of the original game, it was the first 3D fighting game to come into the industry, that introduced 6 characters with their own fighting styles. Originally on the 32X, it came into the Saturn later. It received a remix version with improved visuals. Unlike Radiant Silvergun, Virtua Fighter 2, and the series overall, has no narrative, no ending, none of that. It does have a bit of it in the manual, but it doesn't seem to showcase in the game itself. The premise is simple. You pick your character, fight off opponents, and get into the final boss. It has 9 original characters from both the original and the remix, and has new ones. What makes this an improvement over the first game is that it has a bit more going on, such as counterattacks, preventing throws, and 60 frames per second. This almost has the same texture, mapping, and visuals as its predecessor, and yet its frames increased. There isn't much to go over. It's a decent fighting game, not quite as interesting as Tekken, but still worth going into. It's one of the few US Saturn games you can easily afford online, so it won't cost you your mortgage. Knights is an action game developed by Sonic Team. Yes, that Sonic Team. The premise follows 2 characters named Elliot Edwards and Clarice Sinclair, who go into a realm where they sleep called the Night Dimension, a plane of existence which is split into 2 types of places. One is Nightopia, or World of Dreams, and another is Nightmare, which, by its name, are made up of nightmares. The creator, known as Wiseman the Wicked, created the Nightmarans to destroy Nightopia and steal some type of dream energy from humans known as Idia. Once he takes enough of them, he'll have the necessary power to take over the world. Yeah, that's the typical trope we go. Let's get moving on. The gameplay has you control either Elliot or Clarice to free knights from the Idia Palace, but the enemies take other Idias, except for the red ones being that of courage, before having a chance to do so. It still leaves the player to free knights and proceed to the level. Each level, a total of 7, has a time limit, and to control knights upon merging it with either Elliot or Clarice. Your goal is to destroy the jellyfish machine called the Idia Capture. By collecting enough of the orbs, 20 to be exact, once collected enough, you can destroy the Idia Capture and proceed to the next part of the level. Each part changes as you progress, which becomes more difficult and longer. However, if you run out of time, via not getting the orbs on time or attacked, you'll revert back to the human character. That, or before merging with knights. You can explore the level in advance, before a short time. An egg-shaped clock will appear and chase after the character, resulting to a game over. Another thing to keep in mind is that if time runs out before knights could ever reach the Idia Palace, an invisible force field will appear in the Idia Palace, and it won't let Elliot or Clarice merge until they recover the elapsed Idia by themselves. Knights itself has abilities. The drill dash, which can be done by holding the A, B, or C buttons. You can paraloop by either the D-pad or analog stick, which is if you own the Saturn 3D pad like I have, to destroy your enemies. Shapeshifting is another ability. In some situations, knights can turn into a mermaid in water and into a bobsled in any icy level. Once you clear the levels, you're taken to a boss fight. Just like the levels, you have a limited time to defeat them. Get attacked by them, you lose time. But if you are quick to respond to their attacks and dodge, you can make it through and defeat them. The game also has a multiplayer mode, in the form of Knights and Riala having a rival match. Yes, Riala is the shadow equivalent to Sonic's Knights. There's a good amount of replay value, hence the levels are quick and have some interesting areas to explore for orbs. Obviously this was hyped up by Sega to fly in the game. Funny how it would backfire, since Spyro came out on the PS1 later on. Though the difficulty curve can be a bit of a stretch, given how some of the levels tend to be a little bit longer. However, with just enough time to adjust into the moveset and good reaction to incoming hazards, you should be able to proceed with ease. Behind the game was Naoto Oshima. Yes, the same guy who is behind Sonic, Knights of the Dreams obviously, and the underappreciated Xbox exclusive, Blinks the Time Sweeper. This is another game you can buy as a Japanese port without needing to read too deep into the Japanese subtitles. The game eventually got into the Xbox 360, PS3, and Steam later on. But this is a Sega Saturn we're talking about, so I'd recommend getting it there either way. The 3D gamepad is an option, but it's a bit pricey to afford. I got 2 of them at a game exchange for around $35 or so each. It tends to go higher online, so be careful when considering the option. Or just stick with the standard version, since the Saturn doesn't have a lot of titles that require the 3D pad anyway. I figured I'd save this game for the very best and last. Enter Panzer Dragoon Saga, or Azel Panzer Dragoon RPG in Japan. This is a special case for Panzer Dragoon because, unlike the rest of the series, it's an RPG and not a rail shooter. This game takes place 30 years after the first game. Remember, SWI comes before that. It begins with a group standing guard at a cavern, a young man named Edge along with them, who is the protagonist of the game. It turns out to be an excavation site by the Empire. It wasn't until something mysterious occurred inside and went to check it out. However, a fleet appears and is led by Admiral Kramen, the game's primary antagonist. It turns out that he's going after what Edge and his group are after. Inside, Edge and his men came across an entity slumbering named Azel. They were attacked by Kramen and his followers and took the girl afterwards. Edge survived some time after and was found by a dragon. He climbs aboard and sets out to avenge his comrades. Raymond was to capture Azel in the ruins, who was kept in a state of stasis for several years by ancient technologies. The gameplay has a unique style of RPG elements. You control the dragon Edge is riding on, venture throughout each level you can travel to and find items, objectives, and so on. You'll have a menu to check on your progress. There's a list of items, infantry, and information regarding the lore of Panzer Dragoon, such as the bestiary. There's also the option of changing your dragon's design to specific methods in battle. You can have an option to use attack, defense, agility, or spiritual. That is if you upgraded from basic form to valiant. The dragon forms affect how you perform in the battle. It can be fast but weaker, stronger but slower, more recovery or less. Speaking of battle, you've given a HUD. Not only that, you're also given a color code. Now, sometimes you'll come across enemies regardless of the code in some situations, but in normal cases, it'll tell you how often you'll come across enemies. The blue indicates no harm or little. Yellow is medium and red is danger. Once you come across an enemy, a flash of white light will enter and begin the fight. What separates this from other RPGs is its lack of turn-based elements. Instead, you're given a rounded fight. You'll have to move around to avoid getting attacked. The green in the circle indicates you're safe. The cleared is medium and red is an enemy will attack. The attack meter can go up to 3 gauges. You can either attack with the dragon's homing attack or Edge's gun. You can also heal your dragon in the fight. This goes for using special attacks which you can use throughout the game as you progress. You can change Edge's weapons. However, the enemies will likely use the battles to their advantage, so it's best to examine what your opponents will do. It's also worth noting that some enemies are invulnerable to homing attacks, while Edge's gun can do the trick. But that's not the only aspect of the gameplay. Enter Edge. There are locations where you can set your dragon down and walk in the levels. Similar to a multitude of RPGs, you can talk to people, collect items, and so on. What does make it feel special is it's done in a way like you see in 3D platformers that you can move anywhere. Many of the games, Parasite Eve for example, has a fixed camera angle and will usually have a painting of the level, while Saga has you move your character around in a 3D map, the triggers to be exact. That's not to say that there aren't any fixed camera sections in the game, which there are. There's also campsites where you can let your dragon rest and interact with. It's also another save point in the game, aside from those floating gray and green devices which you can fire at and save your progress there. Beyond that, day and night change. There are moments where the story needs either one to take place, and sometimes you can change how the environment comes out. There are times you can enter some areas, and sometimes you can't. However, you can go through specific areas if you've cleared enough of the levels. I should mention that this game is entirely exclusive to the Sega Saturn. No official remake by the time writing this script. It also comes with 4 discs, so you'll need all 4 of them to play. This can go from $500 to over $1,400 on eBay and elsewhere. As Backwards Entertainment, originally known as Ranting Spider-Man, pointed out in his video to get Panzer Dragoon Saga cheaply, you'll likely pay a fortune just to get a reproduction copy when you could have made one yourself. Link to his video in the description to get Panzer Dragoon Saga cheaply. I bought both versions of the game, though one of them is a reproduced English subtitled copy. You can get the game much cheaper by buying the Japanese version. I know, because I got it prior to the reproduction. However, it only has Japanese subtitles, so unless if you understand the language, you won't be able to understand it. This game is a must-buy, but one that is very pricey. It all depends if it's something that you want to check out. At the end of the day though, Panzer Dragoon Saga still stands in the testament of the time frame, and is worthy of all the love it got back in 1998, and still does to this day. You can check out a few other videos made for such as Backwards Entertainment. All I can say is, remake this game. After Twice is done, of course. With all that being said and done, we can see why Sega Saturn is a commercial failure in the US and Europe, but also an underappreciated piece of hardware and library of games. Sure, the PS1 may have won the battle at the end of the day with Sony's triumphs, and their own failures in 2006 and onwards. Whoops. But the Sega Saturn is still worth appreciating for its impressive specs and exclusives that have not yet seen the light of day. There are a few other games worth looking into, such as Burning Rangers. I haven't got too deep into the game yet, but from what I got so far is pretty fun. You can play as a ranger and your task is to take down fire with water, or whatever that is, and save people trapped in buildings. Once I invest more time into playing it, I'll give it a more proper impression of the game. Dragon Force, honestly, seems like an improvement over its predecessor. I know this sounds crazy saying that, but things such as its gameplay performance and game data really make a step up. I've spent a little bit of time playing it since I've been playing the first game more often, but another game I'll give more time to digest. Virtua Fighter's remix is a good option for the first game, while its Polygon original is still an option. I'd give that a chance. There's also Christmas Nights into Dreams. The gameplay premise is pretty much the same, only difference this time is that you get to play as Sonic the freaking Hedgehog. There are a few others such as New Year's, Winter's, and an April Fool's variant, which actually play as Riala, the shadow to Sonic's Knights. If you have any good Saturn games to include that I haven't mentioned, please comment down below. I'm simply helping the Sega Saturn get somewhere out in the public, so at some point more of these games can not only be seen by newer generations, but also one day either get ported to newer consoles or remade in some form. I want to thank you all for your patience as I've been dealing with a lot of chaos in my life as well as the internet. As I have more content underway, I'm also hoping to produce Sega Saturn content, hence my fondness of the platform and games released for it. Thank you for watching, feel free to sub and like what you see here, and I'll catch you next time. Over and out.